So I am curious how the writers will be affected and how they are feeling about this new era of AI-powered or AI-assisted content. I would assume it's rather controversial internally.
I'm sure they fucking hate it. Serious Entertainment, which is a company I had never heard of, but we'll cover a bit, has acquired the mobile studio Pixelberry from Nexon. So Serious Entertainment is, as they call it, a fast-growing AI game development company, which has acquired the interactive fiction mobile game studio Pixelberry. This is a studio that is known for their smash hit choices. The Serious Entertainment, I looked at these guys, I hadn't heard of them. They've recently announced what they call their Row engine, which claims to be a, quote, AI-native multimodal game development platform. I don't know what the fuck that means, but, in theory, what they're doing is they're helping to develop tools that use AI to build games. So why does it make sense in this context? So I have no idea about the details of this business, but strategically, I think this makes a lot of sense. So Choices has a framework for gameplay that's basically a narrative story plus a simple, replicable graphic style, which has been honed for a decade and, done fairly well. It's been a very serious contender to be one of the top grossing mobile games for the last decade or so. This game has struggled, and I'll pull up some metrics to show sort of how the game has declined over time. Basically, their only major ongoing cost center is they're not doing UA anymore, and so it's just the content generation. So if you can decrease the cost generation by, call it 10x, which I think based on what we've done internally, it's not crazy to imagine that the cost of producing stories, especially stories that are very formulaic, and then creating graphics, that's like a perfect use case for AI. Assuming they can continue to crank out these stories using AI, it seems like a pretty smart play. I know, Warren, you were close to this deal, the original acquisition. Do you want to talk a little bit about your thoughts?
Yeah, I have a lot of weird connections. I'm friends with a lot of the folks over on the Pixelberry team. I got to know them because I was personally pretty deeply involved in the last acquisition of Pixelberry when I was in my prior role at Nexon, leading user acquisition for their US mobile office. Without disclosing anything I shouldn't disclose, I was a part of the squad in charge of vetting the numbers and then also working with their marketing team on some of the growth strategy and execution following it. So, Choices is a genre-defining product for interactive fiction. Historically, it's been a very strong product with a lot of copycats. I know less about the current kind of competitive landscape of that genre because we don't have a game of that genre in the Uptick portfolio right now. But I also think it's an interesting acquisition. The party acquiring Serious Entertainment, the CEO of that company, is also a friend of mine, so I kind of know on both sides of this. But I do think it makes sense in any scenario. AI is almost certainly going to play a critical role in the genre of interactive fiction. And I don't think that is a skill set kind of native to the Pixelberry team. Again, I'm a few years removed from the ins and outs of the business, but I do think that this is an acquisition that makes a lot of sense for the convergence of these two platforms of interactive fiction and AI. So it's not the worst acquisition. Last thing to add, during my time at Nexon, I will say Choices, though a great product, was always a little bit of odd duck in the Nexon portfolio, which skews more traditional gamer, mid-core, hardcore. So it may be something too where it was felt on both sides that it wasn't the optimal home for
Right.
Choices as a franchise and Pixelberry as a business. I have no inside knowledge on the more recent state of things there, but just an observance that I saw in my time working between the teams.
Yeah, I dug into Sensor Tower a little bit. I thought it was just interesting to look at the overall trajectory of the game. So this is the Wayback Machine. We're looking basically at the game, both revenue and downloads from the inception. I mean, it's had a very long and storied career in terms of downloads and also printing millions and millions of dollars per month in revenue. And this is just IAP because it's Sensor Tower. But if you zoom in on the most recent, call it 6 months, there's a even more interesting story. Actually, let's go a year, which is to say, this is a game which had clearly been spending on UA, downloads sort of flat, revenue sort of flat. And then towards December of last year, they had a big surge in UA, revenue sort of maintained. And then around the time they were rumored to have meaningful layoffs, downloads dropped to basically nothing. So you can tell basically they had their push in Q4 for Christmas, and then went, I don't think there's a long-term business here, cut the team, cut UA, let's sell the product. And so it's just really, really interesting digging into the data because you can see exactly sort of the story that goes from long storied history of game that grew sustainably over a long period of time, last hurrah, and now we're in our sunset phase, and let's give another team an opportunity to see if there's anything left in this game. So any thoughts here? Just kind of interesting to see.
That is interesting. I would say that's projecting a lot of assumptions on the story of what happened there. No pun intended. But, in the course of M&A, a lot of weird things can happen with a business's operation. Some of them are intentional. Some of them are teaching to the test of, getting metrics to a certain point, either cost or revenue metrics ahead of an acquisition.
We had downloads. They dropped off really sharply in January. it's around the same time that they fired a bunch of their team. We didn't get details, but there are news articles that said in January they fired some of the team. Installs go to a trickle, likely cutting off UA, and then you just see the slow decline in revenue. And, it makes sense that, you're prepping the business to be sold, especially if you're trying to make the game look more profitable than it is a tried and true tactic where you stop spending into the game, you just milk the existing cohorts, and that makes it look really nice and expensive for a sale. So don't know if that's happening here, but I've seen it done before.
I mean, to put another way, it looks like a lot of the current value in revenue driven is from one thing that I think Choices has is really long retaining kind of like a very strong core user base. One thing that I saw in my time contributing to the project. And I think that's kind of represented in this chart where new user acquisition turns off, but you still have like a, still slightly declining, but relatively flat contribution of existing revenue, which I think speaks to a strong core historical. So probably like a lot of teams, there's with struggles with navigating, and continuing to scale and find profitable strategies, especially for a title that's been on market for a while, as long as it is. But it's also, as you said, Xander, there may have been choices that they made, no pun intended, again, to do things a certain way ahead of potential M&A effort.
Well, and the one last thing here is this is not a game that's like a systems-based game, right? It is a content-driven game. So the thing that you need to continue to eke value out of those long-term users is a continuous flow of content. And what better way to get a continuous flow of content than use AI images and AI generated stories that you can then slot in relatively cheaply compared to the human counterpart, which then extends the life of these long-term users at a much cheaper cost base. So that's why I think the premise of this acquisition makes sense. Anyway.
Yeah. No, it's an interesting point too. I mean, one other thing that I'll shout out to being a strength of Choices is they had a very strong team of writers historically. Again, I know less about the current state of the business, but in working with them, I got to meet a lot of the writers. People loved being there. The community really spoke to the quality of the writing as being one of the differentiators between Choices and other interactive fiction pieces. And the writers themselves were very passionate and happy to be there.
Right.
So I am curious how the writers will be affected and how they are feeling about this new era of AI-powered or AI-assisted content. I would assume it's rather controversial internally.
I'm sure they fucking hate it.
We'll see. I think, it's going to be an interesting story nonetheless, because you see there's been something that's been so core to what brought Choices through its first phase, which has been great writing, great writers. And now this thesis about a 2.0 phase for the business that is AI assisted, I think it's going to be testing a lot of the theses and controversy around the relationship between AI and artists and content creators. And so, I don't know, this is a story that I am very interested to check in like 6 months after this acquisition and see what's happening.
There's a more interesting theme here, which actually ties into something that we cut, which I think I want to just bring up really briefly, which is to say we have all these games who are decade-old games. Another one is Clash of Clans, which we almost covered today. There's a topic that we won't get into. But one of the main complaints against Clash of Clans is they've basically rejiggered the whole economy to require you to start paying back into the ecosystem. So what does that do? It upsets a lot of players, but it brings a lot of money. It's like with the cigar butt is the metaphor that Warren Buffett uses. It's a cigar butt play where you're just going to say, okay, this is a declining asset, but we're going to get as much money out of the asset as we can at a lower cost base. And understanding we're going to turn the product out. And so I think that's something we're going to see and are seeing across a lot of different mobile games is people taking these legacy games and being like, all right, we have one last hurrah, or like another 5 to 10 years. How do we squeeze as much value out of that asset as we can? And this seems like a very clear-cut play in that direction. I mean, who knows? Maybe the AI writing will be great. My guess is it'll be marginally worse, but maybe not noticeably to the average consumer. But it's just interesting to see how all these different game companies seem to be employing disparate but similar tactics to say, okay, declining asset, how do you get money out of it? Anyway, that's it. Thanks for joining us. Warren, take us out.
Thanks, everybody. I hope you enjoyed the episode this week. As always, this news episode was brought to you by our team here at Uptick. You've probably heard us say this before, but at Uptick, we love to scale games. We do all the work to scale games profitably, sustainably, and it's the best job in the world. So if you are building a cool game, we would love to be your allies and bring that game to market in a profitable and sustainable way, doing the creative work, the user acquisition work, and all of the analytics and reporting around that, amongst other things that you need to do to launch a game. So thanks again, everyone, for tuning in this week. And you can check Uptick out on our website. It's upptic.com.
Talk soon.